When one door closes, another door opens. Other than that, yeah, it's a pretty good car. I've been googered. I'd like to talk about a subject that's really close to my heart, and that's automotive customization and the individuality that it brings. Something I was raised with. My father was into customizing cars long before I was. I mean, I remember when I was 4 years old, my dad had his daily driver was a 1950 Ford convertible that with a flathead V8 and a 3-speed T85 transmission, and he was in the process of rebuilding a Columbia 2-speed rear axle to put in it that he got out of a Lincoln Zephyr. Also in his stable was a 1939 Lincoln Zephyr 3-window coupe that had a V12 in it, the mighty 292 V12 from 1939. A very interesting and really cool car. That combination, that of engine and transmission and rear axle, that 292 V12 with a T85 3-speed overdrive transmission and a Columbia 2-speed rear axle, to me, is the holy grail of hot rodding, and what really embodies the spirit of what I'm after on this particular build. Now, this car that I'm working on, this Boattail, used to be my dad's. He gave it to me and asked me to just make it my dream. In fact, he said this:
"It's your dream now."
He also asked me not to sell it. So it's a personal thing, and people might wonder, well, Zach, you're cutting this thing up. You're changing everything. Isn't this somehow some kind of disrespect for your father who started this project? Not really, and let me explain why. Back in 1985, I think it was, that he purchased this kit car. It came from the factory with a book that telling exactly how it was supposed to be put together and what engine to put in it, what transmission, all that stuff. Well, in typical car customizing fashion, my dad viewed that book of instructions as a treasure trove of information and a whole bunch of suggestions. You probably saw in one of my earlier videos when my dad said this:
"It's not stock. It's not stock, that's for sure."
Stock? That's like a dirty word.
Yeah.
That's because the first thing my dad did after reading that book and looking through it was to change things that he didn't like. And that's the way I was raised, to work on cars. So when my dad told me that this was my dream now, for me to confine myself to his dream when building this car would actually be disrespecting my father. So I'm respecting my father by making this car my dream and really moving forward. The nice thing about this car, it represents something to me personally, because my dad was Mr. Flathead. He put flathead V8s in everything. When I was growing up, it didn't matter what car we drove. At some point, that car was getting a flathead V8. My dad liked carburetors, he liked point ignition, and that's the kind of stuff I was raised on. Flatheads with point ignition and carburetors. So when he bought this car, he really did a departure from his standard fare. He went with what in 1985 was state-of-the-art equipment. In 1985, state-of-the-art equipment was Mustang II suspension. So he went and got the suspension out of a wrecked 1978 Mustang that with a 302 in it and put that on this frame. It was already set up for that. So that's what he did. And then instead of putting a flathead V8 in it, he got the engine of the day, the 302, and stuck it in there with an automatic transmission because he knew, well, it's what he had. And so that's what I got it with. Well, when I got it, I mean, there was, back in the 80s, there was an option, but it was pretty much made from unobtainium. And what I mean by that is the average hot rodder couldn't afford this option. Only guys with a lot of money could do it. And that was independent rear suspension, IRS. The only sources of that was, number one, you had to find a wrecked Corvette. And then you had to take all the parts out. You had to figure out how to attach all the attachment points to get this rear end in there. The other option was Jaguar rear suspension. These were really the only two IRS rear ends that could hold up to the power of a V8. You could, I suppose, get the rear end out of a Datsun 280Z, which was IRS as well in rear drive, but you'd turn it to hamburger the first time you laid into the throttle. So it was designed for their fuel-injected 6-cylinder, and it did fine in a very light car with a 6-cylinder, and you know, that was good. But putting the torque of a V8 up against that rear end would not end well. So really there was no option for the average guy to run IRS suspension. Well, now fast forward to our day. Here we are, 2021. A lot has happened since then. Check out what I got that I'm putting in the hot rod. Well, got an issue, but I think I got a fix. So, check this out. Back in the 80s, when this car began to be built, this was the rear axle to get. This is a Mustang 2 from 1978, the 5-liter. It had the 8-inch forward rear end, and it was narrow. It would fit these little cars, but it had drum brakes because back in the 80s, very few cars had disc brakes. And if they did, they were still pretty new. So you really wouldn't buy them and strip them for parts. So drum brakes were the thing. These also had 4-bolt hubs. You can't really see it because it's got these cheesy basket wheels on it, and at some point I'm going to pull those off. Another problem that this rear axle has is it's leaking from all the seals. Now I know some work was done to this many years ago, and it's never been on the road since, but the seals have dried out and all the gear lube is leaked out. It's rusty, and I looked into the cost of rebuilding this rear axle and putting 5-bolt flanges on it and converting it to disc brakes and all the things I'd want to do. And it turns out it would cost me over $1,000 to do that. So I thought, what am I going to do? Well, since then, you know, all through the 90s and into the 2000s, they started making cars with 4-wheel independent suspension, 4-wheel disc brakes, all that wonderful stuff. And I thought, you know, I bet you I could replace this rear end cheaper than I could fix it and put something really cool in there. Now I've just got frame rails and leaf springs, and the shock towers, and that's it. That's all that's hooked to this. It's also has this containment ring for the drive shaft, which is going to be removed anyway. And I thought, what can I do to upgrade this now that we're decades in the future? I mean, this was started in the 80s and it's now 2021, almost 2022. There's a lot more choices out there than there were back in the 80s. So let me show you what I got. and what it took to get it. Here a few years ago, I was looking at a project a coworker of mine had. He had a Mustang from the 90s, and he pulled the rear differential out of it. It was an independent, IRS suspension, independent rear suspension, and he put a solid axle in it because he was drag racing the car and he didn't want to break the axle. And I thought, that's pretty cool. But man, getting a Mustang rear end is expensive. People are really proud of them. So I did some research and I found out that in the late 90s, Ford Thunderbird and Mercury Cougar had IRS suspension. So I thought, well, that's cool. But they're not cheap either if you go buy the parts at a wrecking yard. However, because these cars are not a lot to look at and they're getting old, you can pick them up for under $1,000. This guy wanted $900 for this car. I wanted to pay him $500. And after some shrewd negotiations, we wound up at $750. Now, I can't even rebuild the rear end on my car for that price. And I'm going to get a lot of parts off this car, starting with the IRS independent rear suspension that's in it, that also has disc brakes. And the cool thing about the independent rear suspension on these is it's one solid unit. You take out 4 bolts and unhook the shock towers, and the whole thing drops out, and all of your mounting points, all of your geometry is preserved, and you just make new mounts on the back of the hot rod and bolt it up, and all of a sudden you have an independent rear suspension on your hot rod. When I bought this car, the guy said, yeah, it runs great. I drive it often. It's my old reliable. It always starts up. Well, he lived in the city, and he only drove it on little short trips here and there. Well, I had to drive it for like 2 or 3 hours at freeway speeds getting home. I got partway home, and man, it just started rattling and knocking and locked up and quit. And I coasted into a parking ride. I just happened to almost make it to the parking ride. And when I did, a guy from the city helped me push it in place. And then my buddy with a car trailer, my buddy Al, him and his son-in-law, another buddy of mine, Dorian, they came and helped me load this on the trailer. And we got it home. And by the time they got there, it had cooled off enough, it fired right up, and I drove it up on the trailer. And then I drove it off the trailer when I got it home. At least the guy left me some change in a little pouch here, so I'm feeling lucky.